Bob, I've started the recording. Have a good session.
All right. First of all, everyone, I'm going to thank Patty Shea with the chapter office for the tremendous help she's done in getting those of us who are technologically adverse into having this set up and ready to go for you. Good afternoon. Welcome to one of the meetings of, not meetings, but presentations of the APA Florida Chapter's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. The committee was formed to try to look at how we as planners begin to address providing opportunities to hear all voices within the planning community, both as planners, as well as the communities that we represent, and making sure we're doing the best to learn about those communities and serve them as best we can. And today, as part of our continuing efforts to provide what I'm referring to as the voices of planning, our session today is called Indigenous Planning and PlaceKnowing, Shifting the Conversation. And we would like to welcome Dr. Theodore Ted Jojola as our presenter. And just as some background, let me just tell you about Dr. Jojola. He has a PhD, and he's a distinguished professor and Regents professor in the Community and Regional Planning Program, School of Architecture and Planning at the University of New Mexico. Currently, he is the founder and director of the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute. IDPI works with tribal communities throughout the Southwest region as well as internationally by facilitating culturally informed approaches to community development. From 2008 to 2010, he was the visiting distinguished professor at Arizona State University, where he was a member of the faculty of the School of Geographic Sciences and Planning. He was director of Native American Studies at the University of New Mexico from 1980 to 1996 and established the interdisciplinary undergraduate degree program in Native Studies. He's actively involved in major research projects on Indigenous community development and PlaceKnowing. He is the co-editor of two books, The Native American Philosophy of V.F. Cordova, entitled How It Is, and also Reclaiming Indigenous Planning. He has published numerous articles and chapters on topics related to Indigenous design and planning, stereotyping, and economic development. And he is an enrolled member of the Pueblo of, I'm going to let, is it Aslata? Correct me, Dr. Jojola, with that. Forgive me for butchering those names right there. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jojola, who's going to, like I said, talk with us and share his knowledge today.
Great. Well, thanks, Bob. My name is Ted Jojola, and I'm from the Pueblo of Isleta, which those of you who know New Mexico, our casino brand is we're 7 lucky minutes south of Albuquerque, but as we all know, in terms of our planning world, gentrification and leapfrogging and urbanization has caught up with us. So now it no longer is 7 minutes, it's more like 20, and on a bad day, it can be up to 2 hours. So there goes the neighborhood, as they say. But with that, I'm happy to lend some of our work and conceptual framework and development for our institute here in the School of Architecture and Planning. And I am going to apologize because the bandwidth here in my home office is not super great. So as I do my PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to turn off my video because I can get a little bit more broadband from doing that. So just bear with me from that standpoint.
And Dr. Jojola, Bob here, just one other small housekeeping thing I forgot to mention. Dr. Jojola is going to do his presentation. If you have questions, place those in the chat, and then at the end of this presentation, we'll turn to the chat and then be able to respond, have Dr. Jojola respond to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, so as I indicated, the Institute itself was established in 2011. And it really is there in order to promote the idea of how you can use culture and identity as a way to inform community development. So many of the groups that we work with are very much in the middle of trying to think about how to resolve a lot of impacts that has been weighed as a result of, as we say, trying to change us to the other, which in many cases has served us, but has also not served us. So many of the kind of communities that we're engaged in really, in a sense, are trying to reformulate this for themselves. So what I'm going to do is basically give you some of the basic concepts that we use in our approach, but also then delve into some of the case examples of some of the groups that we've worked with and how we've actually applied these particular concepts. So I'm going to go ahead and get going here. So the first thing that is really important to understand, especially about place-based communities, is the fact that we feel that if a group of people occupies a place for successive generations, that inevitably they form a worldview. And that worldview essentially basically answers the question of who am I and what is it that we understand around the world that's around us. And this globe here depicts some of that kind of understanding in graphic form for our Pueblo people. We've got the Rio Grande River, which courses down the center, which is represented by that ribbon. We've got the 4 sacred directions, and there's actually 7 if you include the nadir and the above and below. But within there, then you see the topography with the mountains where we have the snowfall that represents our storage for water. And then during the spring melt, then it renews the life along the river. And we use gravity flow as a way then to build our subsistence in terms of agriculture. The grid pattern there basically depicts now the ability to tap into groundwater, but with that then has come the imposition of the grid system, which is not indigenous to us, but which of course typifies a lot of the urbanization around us. What's really important to understand about the ecological balance of this area is we're a high plains desert. And as a result of that, even though our river is minuscule by comparison to a place like the Mississippi, for example, a lot of people don't realize that that green little part of the river, which represents the longest continuous grove of cottonwood trees, is the only area from an indigenous perspective that actually sustained large amounts of growth. And the higher plains actually did not. All of that is now artificial. But the flow of the river is such that when you see the surface water, that's only 10% of the entire volume of the water that's traversing there. 90% is underground. And that's in a sense what it is that we tap into to sustain the kind of lifestyle that we have today. So the other important aspect of this is what we call the 7 generations model, because as typified by the worldview, then the challenge that comes forth is then how do we transfer that knowledge of the ancestors and do it in a way then that builds a sense of continuation into the future. So those of you who know New Mexico, this is actually a schematic of a very important ancestral site for us called Pueblo Bonito. If you've ever had a chance to be there, you know that this is what that particular site looks like. And what's so amazing about this is that it incorporates a lot of the traditional knowledge that was born by the ancestors. It has lunar orientations, solstice orientations, there's dualities represented there. There's the star systems, the Pleiades, and it goes on in terms of what actually the positioning of all of these elements did. But what a lot of people don't understand is the fact that it took 140 years to complete this structure. And there were actually, from the archaeological evidence, 7 distinct phases. So you do the math, it's about 20 years per phase, which probably in that era represented what was a generation. And the message that we can gain from this is the fact that the people who actually began this did not live long enough to see its completion. So our conversations about how to think about long-range planning deal with generational think. And the way that we engage with community is to basically ask people to imagine themselves as the middle generation, and then you're preceded by your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents, and then you're anteceded by your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren. And within a healthy community, every one of those should be present. They may not necessarily be related to you directly, but nonetheless, they are there in a healthy community. And if not, then that's where the conversation begins, but also to acknowledge the fact that what it is that we have inherited from our ancestors helps then to position us in terms of our role to sustain what it is that we've inherited for those future generations. And that our goal is the same as our ancestors. How can you imagine creating such a beautiful place like this and not yourself living long enough to see it, but whatever it is that they indicated as the instructions were so compelling that it ended up creating this amazing thing. So circle is attended to what we consider to be the immediacy of ourselves. Some of you have probably seen a lot of this in terms of how it is that we related to the completion of life. And the way that we can kind of think about this is that that circle represents our birth and our death. And as it moves around either in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction, which is also metaphorical to our notion of migration as people, that the completion of that then represents our role and our emergence here in terms of time and place, but also our sense of mortality in terms of the continuity of the civilization that we belong to. And the way that we translate that is indicated by this example here with a community that we work with at Isleta del Sur in El Paso, Texas, another Pueblo community that has an amazing history that I'll talk a little bit more about. But what you need to sort of see here in this diagram is you see this red curve that represents a sine curve. And basically what it maps out is that if you take a circle and you take the center and rotate it at a constant rate across a plane, then what it maps out when you select the tangent point is exactly this curve that's here. So this next diagram will demonstrate what that actually looks like. So you see that tangent point that represents your point in life from birth to death as it's mapped out across a horizontal time frame or timeline, and that then represents completion. So as it's applied then to this particular diagram is when we talked with the community about what were the important values of a person as they lived their life and how they learned that through their lifetime in the community, then we begin with birth at the beginning where you learn your meaning, your values, and your language, and then you go into your teenage years and you start understanding your traditions, your roles, your skills, and then as you go into adults, you take on position, responsibility, you build leadership, become parents, and as you become an elder, then there's the maintenance and the connections and the passing on of traditions, your knowledge of the past, the connection to the past, and ultimately you become the teacher within the community. And as you pass on, then you pass that knowledge on to the next successive generation. But in this particular aspect then, what was important in the light bulb moment in our conversation was to say, okay, so what were the institutions that exist within your community that help to maximize or to support that lifelong learning activity and experience? So here they said they had an interactive learning center, which they worked with their children. They had a nation building hub, which they worked with their teenagers. They had a multi-generational place where they worked with their adults. Their garden and landscaping was part of their sustainability for their community. And then they were thinking about a senior activity center, which was in planning, but which they had yet engaged. But what you can see then is the fusion of this life circle as it's completed, but also now acknowledging that these institutions, which are maintained in time and place over time, in terms of more of the historical progression than existed at this place. So it was really an important moment for the community to realize what the role of their government was in any of that process. So Ysleta del Sur then in the 7 generational model then helped to map out the kind of values that were really important to them. And as we worked with them, they came to us to see how it is that we could assist them in developing what they call the cultural buffer zone. The challenge being that because they were within the city limits of the city of El Paso, that nobody was respecting their territory and their boundaries anymore. And the evidence for this were signs like this, which basically said, don't do this, don't do that, but people were ignoring them. And it was causing a whole bunch of public safety issues with regards to people trespassing, just acting recklessly within the streets, not acknowledging where it is that the people had their various kinds of activities. And what we did was systematically then start working with them to think about the notion of place making and what it is then that they wanted to be able to develop in terms of their own historic patterns, but that these historic patterns of growth and development were not monolithic by any chance, but that represented different centers of activity upon which they could build identity that would make people respect who it is that they are. So this shows the red line, which is their traditional boundary. They've been subjected to the winds of all sorts of processes of state, federal recognition, losing that. They lost a large amount of their land. The only parts that they retain to this point are the ones that are indicated in this kind of orange color. We also gave them an idea that, you know, these other ones could be potentially available for them to purchase. But this network that existed here consisted both of the streetscape, but also the acequia or the ditch systems which they had. And that they could begin to use this as a way to make their community much more permeable, but also identifiable from a community engaged perspective. So we, being invested in the School of Architecture, have access to great designers and thinkers who we collaborated with to begin to reimagine this kind of landscape. So you see the ditch system here, you see the open undeveloped tribal lands here, and the basic conceptual model was how can you use all of this kind of landscaping and imagery in order, in architectural styles, in order to begin to change that identity. So it ranged all the way from art work to providing buffer zones with these intermodal kind of bike trails, providing these kind of seated beds to keep the traffic away from the pedestrian flow, to the iconography of the symbols of the community, and then developing an architectural standard style, getting back to the traditional Adobe style of architecture, and then rejuvenating the canopy, which is really important for the kind of heat sink environment that they have as a result of non-development. And just to add some more cultural texture, we made sure to keep the res dog right there in the corner. So that was an example of how it is that we went about getting them to think about how to reformulate this just from using these ways to build this identification. So this shows essentially the vision and the goal that we thought the community itself could begin to develop in terms of a conceptual framework. So here are all the ditch systems that are basically undeveloped at this point. As a wage economy has impacted, they don't do much subsistent agriculture anymore. But we said, here's the opportunity to take the same places and then rebuild them to provide pathways, to provide places where they can develop verdant livestock, agriculture, these canopies, these walkways for interconnectivity, deal with the health emergencies of the diabetes and obesity in the community, and take this great picture here in the center, which in a sense is a modernization of this picture, which they actually had in their tribal council room. And even though this is heavily romanticized, we feel that this other picture that preceded it was an actual attainable standard that they could go towards. So another project that also indicates how we deal with building this kind of cultural representation was a project that I worked as a cultural consultant with a architectural firm based in Phoenix called Studio Ma. And the project was about how to build a Native American Cultural Center at the Northern Arizona University campus. And this is the final building that was dedicated. And it was really indicative of the challenge of the fact that for 21 years, they had struggled with trying to actually develop a proposal for a center, and that they couldn't get above the kind of competing interests that were there and the kind of multiplicity and diversity that was actually represented. They basically gave us instructions about the fact that they didn't want the local archetypes there, being the Wikia, the Adobe House, the Hogan, to dominate, because they felt that the 70 plus student body there representing 70 plus different tribes all needed to find a home and identify with this new center that they were proposing. So the task was basically then, how do we build consensus around this? And the way that this was done was to basically identify the fact that this place is part of the Colorado Plateau, and that it was the center for millennium of migration of various groups that had come in and out, some who ended up staying, but that the geography itself was based around the waterways, and that these provided really important elements in terms of how people could build a sense of identification with regards to this place. So the way that we began to proceed was to have a conversation about this notion of emergence, which is really a key concept in terms of Indigenous thought, because our belief is that we come from the center of the earth, and we then have gone through different levels of transformation, and now we inhabit what is called the fifth level. And we asked various groups and individuals within that group to paint their own image, or to draw their own image of what migration means to them, as a way to represent their own history and their own struggles. So this is the example that was brought forth from some of these kinds of images. And as we took each of these and began to sort of build a framework around what they represented, these became the guiding elements for the actual design and the conceptual planning around the center itself. And in that whole process, I believe we had upwards of 22 different individual committee meetings or group meetings that we had, and each one of them had a different level of representation that they were bringing in. But after we began to summarize all of these, The themes that came out were ancestors and emergence, life journeys, rivers, and time and place. And these then became the kind of components that began the discussions in terms of how it is that they could be represented and be shared then by all the various students that were coming and faculty who were coming into this place and building a kind of center upon which they then could develop all their programming. And what's really kind of key about that, and the reason why migration resonated with them, was because we pointed out that in many cases, the students themselves were on a migration journey, that they were coming from their respective home communities. They were there at the university in time and place, but that their role was to go back to their community and serve them, so that they were meeting the same thing that the ancestors had done in the past. And that's how we began to build this idea of understanding and building consensus. So here is the way that we solve the kind of breaking away from the archetypal forms that the university gave us instructions not to be literal about, but we still use this notion of in and out space, of volume, of a way then of being able to represent these kinds of spaces as spaces which grounded activities that were really important to the community of people that were there. And it was also based on concepts of center place, of gathering, the four directions. All of these were ways in order to be able to situate it. And ultimately then we were able to finally bring this project to fruition. So what had been a logjam for 21 years, actually in our process, took a year and a half from conceptual planning to actual groundbreaking, which is a record, I think, in many projects that you probably yourselves have been involved in. But it was all as a result of building this sense of consensus and bringing these kinds of things in a way that people built a sense of identification. So here's just some of the kind of interior shots. Because of lack of time, I can't really go into the specifics of this, but this is a consensus building room. Here's how the area is situated with the hallways that link all of the different programs. The center space is where the lecture area is, but even the elements here in the space show that kind of emergent spiral going up. And then this scrim here, you can actually change the color of it so that it can go all the way from dawn to sunset and develop a kind of ambience for reinforcing the kind of discussions that are going on. Here's another example of how it is that we went about a PlaceKnowing project. A lot of our new scholarship has been based on that. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with a lot of the efforts that went on with Art Place America, looking at place making. And we had actually been able to get some funding in order to hold conversations across the country about what Indigenous communities understood and knew about placemaking. And in that conversation, it came out that, in fact, that was something which really did not resonate with them. And the main reason was they said, because our communities are already made. So we're not making places. We inherit those places from our ancestors. But what's really the challenge and what's critical to us is knowing the places that we have inherited. So PlaceKnowing then essentially represents that. And it's been articulated best by some of the elders in our communities who basically have said, if we don't walk the land with our children, they will not know the meaning of these places. And without knowing the meaning, then we can't sustain our language, we can't sustain our culture, we can't sustain our identity. And the children will no longer have that relationship, which is so important to us. So PlaceKnowing then becomes really the kind of formulative concept which we embark on when we're dealing with community development, with places, with thinking about how it is that any of these types of conversations can really help to begin to inform how it is that we build a sense of resiliency. So this is a good example of that. This particular community is halfway between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. It's a very traditional community. It's been impacted a lot by outside development. And this shows the plaza area, which is considered to be the heart place. And the basic challenge of this particular project was they wanted to revitalize and bring life back into it. Essentially, what has happened is that HUD housing has displaced a lot of people from the center of the community. People are drawn to the modern amenities of these new houses, which are not adobe, but stick frame, balloon fabricated houses. But it's created what's called this donut effect, where people are living on the periphery, on the outside, but in the center is this void. And this void has become more and more ceremonialized, religious space, even though it's the heart place. The ceremonies still occur here. It's important in terms of the center of the identity of the community, it's in terms of its spiritual sense, but nobody lives there. And the challenge was, what is it that would be the conversations that could begin to actually lead to a plan to re-inhabit this. So you see the interconnectedness that once used to exist. So you've got this ring area here, which is the center. All around is then these new housing types that have come in. And people in some cases have dual houses. So they live in their little HUD houses, but then they also have their ancestral houses here, but they only inhabit them during special occasions. So we wanted to see what is it then that essentially could help to have that conversation and build priorities in terms of how they could go about reclaiming that for themselves. So we used a particular process that is called the International Cafe, where we actually moved people to different kinds of conversation points, informing them with some of the information sets that we brought about the history, the impacts, the policies, and then use that as a way to start building discussion, taking them back out into the community with the mix of generations. The elders, of course, having grown up and lived in the center of the place, had many stories to share, which the younger people themselves no longer identified with because they didn't grow up there. So it was really, in a sense, a kind of unraveling and a real example of this place knowing of how it is then that all of this meaning needed to be not only sustained, but rejuvenated in terms of bringing back life into this place. So here's an example of the different workstations that we set up, and people in their different groups just move through each of these, and each of the facilitators in those groups then had different elements of that conversation. One talked about the plaza, the other talked about landscaping, the other talked about connections to the outside, another talked about the houses in the building, and then ultimately getting to this notion of how do we build a vision. So from those conversations then in the summary points, getting the thematic components out there, and then using this as a way to begin to stage what those interconnections are. So at the end, as kind of a summary form of this, it was represented by this tree, and the tree became such an important element because it turned out that one of the things that had occurred over time was that the elders in particular discussed how it was that at one point the plaza area had these magnificent trees growing there. And as new infrastructure was introduced into the community, such as gas lines and water lines and sewer lines and electrical lines, these trees were being seen as nuisance, so they cut them down. And it inadvertently desertified the area. And it finally came out that in those discussions that they considered the trees as being their outdoor classrooms. and no longer represented then as a major kind of social landscaping element, then this became the kind of symbol of how to renew this place as based on all these various groups in their conversations and what it is that they lent in terms of the kind of way that they could start prioritizing and moving this to a different level of discussion. So I'm going to close with some of the most recent work that we've been doing, which will really resonate, I think, with a lot of you. This is actually done by one of my former students who's kind of taken the ball and really run with it, who's essentially using a different way of community engagement that so far we represent within our Western planning idiom as being the SWOT analysis, or the SWOT process in terms of strategic planning. So we all know SWOT as strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But it became pretty evident that within the communities that these particular kinds of prompts were really not resonating in a way that was culturally appropriate and sensitive and meaningful to the communities that we were engaging in terms of these kinds of strategic planning sessions. So the idea is to change the nomenclature of this and make it much more consistent with the kind of cultural values and build a conversation on that. So in the notion of Pueblo analysis, then the acronym as Pueblo then invokes a different keyword in order to start building that narrative. So the first of this is P is narrative. Painting, the act of painting provokes a narrative that is innate amongst visual learners. So the first activity is draw a picture of your community and show us what it is that's beautiful about it, or something that you remember about it, or something that is important about it. So the conversation becomes one that is shared, that is instated at that point in terms of bringing out the various voices of the group of people that are there. The second activity is to look at the underneath as origin. And this comes from what I said about the notion of emergence as people coming from the center of the earth and then having responsibility as they come to occupy this level of what it is that we call the human level of mortality. And that origin then also comes with values and challenges that need to be overcome in order to be able to form the notion of society and community. East, or E as the next letter, is the other important point of conversation, because this represents the where the direction of renewal is, where in Pueblo tradition, people still greet the sun as it comes up and look at this notion of cycle, just as I had shown before, and talk then about how it is that this role is met in terms of a person's lifetime, in terms of generation within what it is that is being looked at, and how this fits into the long range kind of planning and discussion of this kind of visioning. The next one is B, which is comes from the notion of balance. And that balance is really all about what represents a healthy community. And that balance has to be between human and natural resources. And without that, there's no balance. So the conversation then focuses and centers on that in terms of what people see as being healthy, what it is that they see as being unhealthy, and how that conversation can move into being changed. And then the last two letters are L, which represents love as the mother. Our Pueblo communities are largely matriarchal, and this leads to unconditional love, but also it's a real statement about trying to also validate and empower the community to think of itself in a positive vein instead of a negative vein. Because I think all too often We go into the communities and tell everybody what it is that is wrong, and in a sense, achieves nothing but belittling themselves. And no wonder they don't want to participate, because who wants to basically be talked down to as being, inadequate? And the idea then of looking more from the standpoint of empowerment and how it is that these places are beautiful already, in a sense, builds a much more important and nurturing relationship in terms of this overall discussion. And then the last is O as ceremony, which comes from offerings. And that really represents the collective will and spirit, and in a sense, begins to change that narrative away from an individualistic thing to looking at it from the standpoint of how it is that you empower the whole community in order to engage and move towards a common resolution of what it is. So this last slide, I think essentially represents the kind of challenge that many of our communities are grappling with. This was actually done by an 11-year-old child from one of our small Pueblo communities here. And he depicts the kind of decisions and the weight of those decisions in the future in terms of how it is that it validates or respects or results in building a strong sense of community. So he represented by that diagonal, which is the spirit line, which is the decisions that are to be made. And if they're done in a culturally respectful, value respectful way, then you see the verdancy of that community above the diagonal. And then if you don't respect that and you go instead for individualism, for capitalism, this is also a casino tribe that he's from, then you desertify the area, and that he sees this as the desertifying of the community itself. So this kind of depiction, I think, really, in a sense, keys in on what it is that gets our juices flowing as planners in terms of how is it that we really get this notion of communities to be not just respectful, but build a meaningful process in a sense that really results in building something that is better and healthier for their own community. So this is a cohort of some of our students at the dedication of our new School of Architecture, which was groundbreaking of that was way back in 2004. So we've been really successful at bringing in and beginning to empower a lot of our own Indigenous students to become and aspire to be planners. They're strategic, they serve in many different positions now all over the state. We're really proud of that. And with that, this is where you can contact me or us at our Indigenous Design and Planning Institute, what we like call as IDPI. So, I welcome at this point anybody to come out and reach out and learn more about us and learn about the way that, we go about working with all the communities that are around us, and also, in a sense, hopefully influencing all of you a little bit in terms of thinking about how you can use these to inform your own style of community development. So with that, I open it up to questions.
Hey, this is Bob here. Well, I was going to say, everyone, I know that I have posted, you're welcome to put comments for chat, but we do have a Zoom function. So if you would, Lindsay, if you unmute, and then anyone who wants to ask a question, just go ahead and talk directly with Dr. Jojola.
Come on, planners are not known to be bashful.
Well, I'll try. One of the things that I think was interesting, well, all of it was interesting, but with BIPOC communities, my experience has been there's been a hesitancy to engage in planning processes. And part of that comes from historical neglect, or neglect in the sense of you didn't want to hear what we had to say, or more importantly, you ignored what we had to say. And so what would be interesting to hear about is your experience in bringing to the table communities where, like when you were talking about the one project where it took 20 years and they didn't see anything happen. How do you get people to still engage when historically they've been marginalized?
Yeah, I think the key to all of that is getting them to really build a meaningful way to engage in that discussion. So we don't assume anything when we go into our communities, in the sense of the fact that they even understand what planning means. Yeah, they've been subjected to all these kinds of processes, especially if they're in tribal leadership or in other kinds of institutions in terms of administration. And everybody kind of banters about this notion that they're planning or are planners. It's our experience that when you look at the planning director for a tribe and you knock on the door, you don't know who's on the other side, what their training actually is. Sometimes, it's just that they bubbled up from other positions. Very few are actually trained in planning per se, but they know little bits and elements of it. So when we engage in a lot of the communities we go into, we do an actual planning 101 session first, just to describe to them what it is that we talk about that represents planning and the language that we use. So, and then we build a context around that by then actually doing analysis ahead of time, such as land use patterns, demographic analysis, programmatic structures, some asset mapping, these kinds of things. We use all of these tools and techniques to go in and say, here's what we know about your community. Now you tell us whether or not it's true or untrue, or it really is representative, not representative. So it's actually giving back information to them once they understand, what that process is about. So it takes education on our side to go in there and not assume that, the community itself knows what it is that's going on. So that's been, really the most helpful thing for getting over that hurdle.
Okay. Lindsay, if you would, if you could allow everyone to turn their video on as well, I think is in addition to unmuting. And then Adrian, you had an excellent question that's in the chat. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to go ahead and talk with Dr. Jojola directly. Okay, sounds not accessible. So I'm going to read Adrian's question. It starts off by saying PlaceKnowing is fascinating, especially as relates to historic preservation planning. I think it's potentially applicable to many historically excluded communities, thinking of groups like the Gullah, Geechee in the Southeast. Do you see positive movement in the overall planning profession in expanding our concepts of place?
That's a no-brainer. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's really coming about as a result of two emergencies that, have essentially challenged us in terms of overall society. And one of this is just the impact of climate change. And then the other one is the pandemic. The climate change, of course, deals with our relationship in terms of our natural world and the landscape. And the pandemic has challenged us with regards to our social community networking. So, within those two realms, I think, we above all are now much more open and are much more receptive to discussions around how it is that we think about this notion of place knowing, because it challenges us in terms of our own sense of resiliency and sustainability in the places that we're at, and the kind of new things that are potentially going to change how it is that we've thought about even the notion of urbanization. Some of the key discussions I know that certainly have been coming our direction, and probably yours in Florida, from what I understand as well too, is this notion of migration amenity. It's, as the sea rises and as, the water becomes depleted, and as the kind of temperate momentum of the climate itself begins to deal with this, we can't afford to continue consuming our resources the same way that we have. And a lot of people are now looking for ways to think about how to build that more sustainable connection with the things that are much more localized, that will see us through these kinds of things, both in terms of our social dimension as well as our natural resource dimension. So yeah, I think it's coming in to that overall discussion.
Okay, several questions. I'm going to go. Ben Lubers asks, are there opportunities for neighboring jurisdictions to support tribal planning and community development on non-tribal land? An example there is through tribally supported art installations, land back programs, adoption of tribally approved design standards. Do tribal plans identify opportunities for their non-tribal partners to do their part in supporting the tribal vision?
I think that's somewhat of a kind of localized discussion. I know, for example, there are some really major important tribes there in Florida, the Seminole probably being one of the biggest. And they've been put into a situation where they're resource rich now as a result of their casino gaming. And it really, in a sense, I think behooves the surrounding areas to enter into partnerships that, are for the benefit not only within a tribal community itself, but the surrounding areas and building these. Examples that, I can draw upon, for example, when I was at ASU, I learned a lot about some of the major tribes that are around Phoenix. And you have the Salt River and the Gila River, which are the largest tribes right next there. And in particular, the Salt River tribe, I remember reading in the newspaper one time that they had given a $400,000 grant to the city of Scottsdale. And it just totally blew me away because, as you know, Scottsdale is a municipality that has one of the highest per capita in the nation in terms of the jurisdiction. And I was saying to myself, why is this tribe giving to this rich, opulent place money to do planning? Well, it was around Papago Park, which is an open space, which is also the ancestral homelands of the tribe. And they were very cognizant of the fact that when they gave that money over, they were also leveraging their place within the decision of doing the master plan for that particular open space. So I think, these kinds of situations benefit not only the tribe itself, but also the other surrounding municipalities in ways that essentially build a relationship that can strengthen the kind of planning that goes on. So it's difficult, to try and go into this because the protocols are so important in being able to reach out, because the basic legacy of many native tribes is, why are you here and what are you trying to tell us to do? Because that's been the kind of, rule of imposition from the outside of trying to assimilate us. So you're going to have to go through that by, re-educating and becoming purposeful and knowledgeable about, who it is that you're having that conversation with. But once you get over that, I think there's a tremendous amount to be leveraged and can be gained from that interaction.
Okay, thank you, sir. Daniel Crotty asks, while it's very useful, it seems like the concept of place knowing is relatively unknown. What's the best way to incorporate that into our traditional planning processes so that it can complement place making more effectively?
I think it's basically changing a little bit of the language that we use when we're engaging with community. That's why we use this 7 generations model. So when we talk with our communities, for example, we don't tend to frame it from the standpoint of 5-year, 10-year, 50-year timeframes. Instead, we say, okay, so what's going to be in store for the next generation, which is your children, or 2 generations down for your grandchildren. And once you evolve that and change that language and build that sense of conversation, it builds a total different level of identification. It's no longer abstract. It's not, well, 5 years from now, it's neither here nor there. I don't know where I'm going to be kind of thing. But when you say for your children, then it becomes much more purposeful, and suddenly they're invested in a much different way. So I think, these kinds of processes, thinking about it in terms of human limitations, and in particular, when we do timelines, for example, with communities, we talk about it from the standpoint of what is it that they remember that was important to what occurred. It really impacted and changed the community in terms of its growth and development. And then we map those out. But we do that for the long term. And with some of our communities, we actually begin that with the emergence, and then bring it into the contemporary situation. And as it gets to the present day, of course, people remember much more what happened. So the number of points there become finer and finer. But all that conversation with around, what were these pivotal moments in the community that contributed to growth and changes in development, then they began to see the pattern. They began to get a longer term perspective and sort of take it away from, well, this is just the here and now, but it's more from the standpoint of, oh, so that's how it progressed. And that's how these influences are now still weighed in on what's occurring today. So it's much longer term in terms of that kind of conversation.
Okay. And one final question that's in the chat here from Tom Taylor. Can we use talking sticks, council circles, and other techniques without it being seen as cultural appropriation? What about asking for storytelling, vision quests, etc.?
So that's where you have to understand the protocol of the community. And if you try and use those particular kind of techniques, it really has to be led by the community. It can't be led by the outside, because then people will naturally see it as appropriation. But if it comes from within, and this is the other thing that is really important for us, even in our work, even though we're an Indigenous community, we're led largely by our own Indigenous practitioners and professionals. We don't assume anything and project ourselves as Indigenous natives meeting with other Indigenous natives. So in that kind of protocol, then we always seek out somebody from within the community who can become the liaison to us, not them as liaison to the community. We want them to help us understand the nuances of our actions. And sometimes even though, we think we're doing the right kind of thing and we see some particular kind of response, if it doesn't seem like it's the right one, then we can go to that person and say, okay, so what's going on here? And then we find out, about the factors that are really moving that particular community. But, in response to this particular question, that protocol really is at the responsibility of the internal community itself. But, if you try to do it as an outsider, even as an Indigenous person, and go in and say, let's do a talking circle, that community may shut us down completely and say, that's not appropriate, we don't do that. And that's why we rely on people in the ground, invested in the community, to really help us navigate those waters.
Okay, well, thank you again, Dr. Hola. I know I've learned a lot. One thing I'm asking to have you email your PowerPoint, if you don't mind. There was a couple of people who had put in chat that they were having difficulty seeing it, so we want to make sure we can share that with them. Again, thank you very much for your presentation. Everyone, thank you for attending, your wonderful and thoughtful questions. And also, if you didn't already, this does qualify for CM credits, so you can seek those through the chapter office. Again, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Hola. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope to be talking with you in the future.
Bye-bye. I get Disney tickets. No.
We'll see what we can do.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
Yeah, I'm still here. Lindsay? Are you still there, Lindsay? Okay. I'm not hearing you, but thank you for your help. Wonderful. And